Okay, so we're going to finish off looking at Near Eastern art, focusing on images of power. And so if you remember on Friday, I had us kind of do a group activity together. And so I linked this for you on the homepage. We were looking at the audience hall of Darius and Xerxes, which is number 30. And so we did this. So we have a Google Doc that we've opened up. So you can open it if you want to. So what I'd like you to do is to work on adding this information to your note takers. So let me grab this bigger for you. So hopefully you can see it. We'll do it kind of section by section. Okay. So a little bit about who Darius and Xerxes are, who the Persians are, right? So you guys divided this up and everyone got it filled out, or filled in, which is great. It was founded by Cyrus the Great, and it flourished for about, really about 250 years. It's really east of Mesopotamia, right? But this is a power that was in constant battle with the Greeks, right? And we'll move to the Greeks after we're done with Egypt. And so the hall that we have for image 30 was commissioned first by Darius, right? So after Cyrus, we have the great leader Darius and his son Xerxes, who eventually took over for him. Right? So one of the things that we see is when we have great empires, right? When we have great empires, we'll see this with the Egyptians as well too. They will often pool resources from the entire empire. So a lot of the building materials used for the apadana, as well as some of the other structures, came from the different parts of the empire. And not only did they bring, right, the rulers bring the supplies, they brought the creative minds as well. So they would bring people who were knowledgeable of Greek temple formats, and we'll see some similarities in the structures. Hey, Ben, welcome back. Okay. Okay, we can talk at the end so you can fill me in on things too, okay? And so they would bring, right, these important minds to Persepolis, right? And they could bring their skill in building, and they could bring their style as well, right? And so why is this so large? Why was the apadana so large? It was supposed to represent the scope of the Persians. It was supposed to show how great the empire was, right? It was there to house and to house like grand banquets and people to come from distant lands to pay homage to the great leaders. It was a place for dignitaries from other regions to come in front of the kings of Persia, the rulers of Persia. And so the apadana, right, is an audience hall, and that helps you once again with the function, right? It's a place where they would just meet people from around the world, which was their world, right? So places of the empire, other trading partners as well. And when we look at the apadana itself, and I'll show you some examples of it, right? It has images of soldiers, it has images of rulers, and it has images of these people, these dignitaries who were coming to Persia, who were coming to Persepolis to see Darius, to see Xerxes. So it shows people from around the empire, right? It shows all the people from all the different empires, and you have to keep in mind that there'd be different ethnicities, there'd be different people speaking different languages, and so it's kind of like like bringing their world together. And the decoration, right? The decoration there often shows the power of the rulers, right? It shows the power of the rulers. Okay. And there's not just images of the rulers, there's things that would be symbolic of the rulers. So I wore my Lamassu from the University of Chicago t-shirt today. And remember the symbols of the ruler, right? A bull, right, is powerful. Eagles and hawks have wisdom, right? Human heads have wisdom as well, right? So we have protector images there that symbolize royalty. So you guys did a great job collecting and pooling this information for each other to share, okay? So keep in mind that if you didn't get all of these notes in, obviously you don't have to write it word for word, bullet points is good. You have this on the agenda, right? You have this linked on the agenda. So I do have a few images from Persepolis to share with you as well. So here we have the plan. So attached to kind of the assignment on Friday, you can see that this is the apadana. It's this red section here. So this is not the entire city of Persepolis. This is just kind of like the royal sector there. And you can see that there was a treasury. It stored the wealth of the Persians. There was a throne room, right? So the throne room was not in the apadana, right? It had the council hall where advisors would meet. We have our palaces of our rulers, right? And then we have a gateway of Xerxes as well. So the style of this image, we have one that's slightly different. It's in color, not that you can tell on your note takers, is this image of the apadana. And you can see that obviously it's missing its roof, it's missing a lot of its walls, but we have these colossal columns left over, and we can see the wonderful relief that was on the surface of the staircase, as well as kind of the platform that this temple was on. And so that's done in relief. Relief is sculptural on one side, right? Relief is something that's sculptural on one side. It's usually made out of the material in which it's on. We think about coins, right? Think about a quarter. It's in relief. We have the head of the president, which is slightly three-dimensional, and then the backside is flat and it becomes the part of the quarter, right? So here you can see the elements of it stick out. You can see the shadows, and it's in kind of a low relief. It's not very 3D. When we get to the Greeks and the Romans, we'll start to see how they become more and more three-dimensional and more detailed, okay? But you get kind of an idea here about how large this space was. Those columns were enormous, right? And these columns are fluted and they kind of take on the style of the Greeks in a way, but they have different decoration at the top. This would have been a hypostyle hall. Hypostyle halls were very common in ancient Mediterranean culture. A hypostyle hall is something we will see again in Egypt. It's basically a large room with a roof that's held up by columns. So there's no like solid wall. Instead, we have a series of columns. And these columns that the Persians made were colossal in size. They rivaled the Egyptians, they rivaled the Greeks, right? And at the very top of them, they had images of power. So they have what we call capitals, and those capitals at the very top have images that convey the power of Darius and Xerxes, right? And so this is not from the University of Chicago, but the University of Chicago has one of these. It is a colossal bull that went on the top of that colossal column. Now, it's hard to tell because I'm not standing near this, and I probably should really take the picture of it a little bit better. This is a fence to keep me away from touching it. So you gotta keep in mind that this fence is probably like up big the capital is, right? It's colossal, right? It is not a dainty thing. So those columns were enormous, but they also conveyed the power of the ruler. So here is on the wall of the staircase, we have a close-up of the image. And what are some of the characteristics you see that are similar to other things we saw in Mesopotamia? Go ahead and chat amongst yourselves. What are the symbols of power that we have here? How do we know who's the ruler? Talk amongst yourselves. Okay, so who's the ruler? The guy on the throne. So people who are seated on thrones, normally the ruler. What else about him tells us that he's the ruler? Where are those symbols of power we study? Yeah. Right. So we have everyone who is facing him, right? And he's bigger. Now, this is just a segment of the relief, but he probably is centered on the panel as well, right? So he's kind of in a central location. He's bigger. So notice how even seated, he's on an equal playing field to his son. So this is actually seated Darius, and then this is Xerxes behind him. So he's big too, but he's not as big as his father, who would be the ruler when this was made, right? Who do we think these people behind are? Yeah. Right? They have his back, right? So you're totally correct. These are his advisors, right? They're smaller than him. They're orderly. They're calm. This is a very calm sort of scene, right? And then who are the people on the right? And what are they doing? Very similar to the law code of Hammurabi. What are they doing? What is this a gesture for? What is he doing? Yeah. He's speaking. So he's not whispering, but he's got his hand cupped to his face so that we can see that he's gesturing and speaking to the king. And notice how he's a little bit more realistic in posture, right? He's bending in. It's much more naturalistic. Even these guys back here, they're not like in strict profile. There's a little 3/4 view to their face. And so they're more realistic because they are the other, right? And that's very common in Mesopotamian and Egyptian art of this period, is that people of power are stiff and formal and calm, and people who are other are allowed to be more realistic in pose, in detail. Now, I would not say that this is super realistic, right? A lot of these people look the same. They've got similar hair. They got similar details in their face. So it's once again very stylized. But I think it's really interesting to see how the Persians portrayed themselves differently than the Assyrians, right? And so remember all those lion hunting images that we saw, right? So it's a slightly different structure that these were on, but our leaders are always cool, calm, and collected, right? But we have one that's more like warriors or depicting themselves as warriors. And we know that Darius and Xerxes were generals as well, right? They were full of warfare, but that's not how they portrayed themselves necessarily at their apadana. So here you can see it from the side to get a feel for the three-dimensional quality of it. This would be orderly procession of the ruler, or excuse me, of the soldiers. Okay, so that is the end of the Near East. We'll look at that review stuff later. Questions on that? Okay, so we're going to move next into the Egyptians, and we're going to start early. We're going to look at early dynastic and old kingdom conventions of power. And so when we think about the Egypt, you guys probably know a lot about Egypt already because I feel like you've probably been studying it since first grade. All right, we know a lot about them already. The land, right, is surrounded by the Nile, right? And we're going to look at different regions of Egypt. Lower Egypt is actually more north. This is the Delta region, right, where the Nile runs into the Mediterranean. And then Upper Egypt, right, is this more southern part. But we will even go more south, right, to this area of the Valley of Kings and Queens and so on. A lot of the great temple complexes of the New Kingdom are here at the base. You can see that their power went all the way down into Nubia as well. Right? So the theme for the Egyptians is the 3 T's. And so what we know about the Egyptians is based on their tombs. Right? We know about them because of their tombs. They did a lot of preparation for the afterlife. Right? We also know about them from their temples. So their temples to various gods and their temples to various rulers who become gods once they become dead. Okay? And the last part is the timelessness part. The reason we know anything about the Egyptians is because they made their tombs and their temples in materials that would last forever. Unlike the Tigris and the Euphrates in Mesopotamia, right? It would flood a lot and they used mud brick. The Egyptians used harder substances for their temples and tombs, but also placed them on more arid lands. And so one of the reasons why we still have things is because they were in drier areas. There is still clothing from Egyptian times, whereas there is not clothing from other places of the ancient world. And it's because it didn't decay because moisture causes decay, right? So I already mentioned a lot about this, but one of the things I want to also show, and this was part of the Art 1010 video, remember the hand-drawn Near Eastern and Egyptian discussion we saw on Smart History, is that besides the fact that things just didn't deteriorate, right? They were far enough from the Nile that they didn't get eroded. They used hard stone instead of mud brick. Their style also remained similar for 3,000 years. The way that rulers were portrayed and gods were portrayed look very similar for 3,000 years. They really had a standard unit of like how people were portrayed, how funerary temples were made, how temples to the gods were made. And the things that we will highlight are those slight variations, right? Why do things change from the old to the middle to the new kingdoms, right? Why do these things change? Right? And so we're looking for those differences. But when you go to any museum around the world, right, you can tell it's Egyptian because it looks so similar. Right? And we know how to read hieroglyphics because of the Rosetta Stone, right? So the Egyptians had several different versions of writing. They developed writing slightly after the Sumerians. So cuneiform was really the first writing that we have, and this comes in a close second. There were several different versions of it. There was, of course, hieroglyphics, which you're so familiar with. That was reserved for really, really important religious and political writing. But then there were other forms of writing as well. Some of them still look like pictographs. They might be things that the priest would use to write, or people would write for commerce. So there's different variations of it. And of course, with the Rosetta Stone, one of the reasons why we can decipher all of this is it also had Coptic in it. So Coptic was the Greek form of Egyptian that's still relevant today. Right? So, like I said, we're going to kind of separate into Lower and Upper Egypt. And we're going to start first in Lower Egypt. Great. So in your study guide, you have on section 10, you have two diagrams for the two sides of the palette of Narmer. And so what you can do if you have your study guide is that you can fill in the imagery, right? We're going to break it apart step by step. Because there's a lot of content on this. And I think that in your note takers, it's probably a little small. It doesn't mean you can't transfer some of the most important things there later, but I think this will be a benefit for you. So this is section 10 in your study guide. Okay, so part one, right? We have images of what? A bull. Now this bull has human features to it. Remember that the Egyptians had imagery that was related to their gods, and they often have either all animal characteristics, all human characteristics, or a combination of them. So we have here our god or goddess, and we think that this is Hathor or Bat, right? So Hathor was the goddess of motherhood, right? She's the goddess of motherhood. Bat is the sky goddess. So even though it's a bull, they're female gods, right? And then in the very center here, this thing, right, that kind of looks like stairs is basically a temple, right? It's a structure. And then in the very middle of it is a chisel and a fish. What could a chisel and a fish be a symbol of? We just talked about Rosetta Stone. It is somebody's name. That is the name of Narmer, right? This is called the palette of Narmer. That is the name of Narmer. It is a fish and a chisel. So that's hieroglyphics of a catfish, which of course comes from the Nile. Now this same part is on the flip side of it at the very top as well. So this section is repeated twice on the palette. It is the only part that's repeated. Okay. So then in the middle, right, we have a lot of visual information. So where are the gods, right? Where are the gods? And how are the gods interacting with the humans? We'll start first with that, right? Where's the gods? Where's the god? Yeah. It is the bird. That is Horus. So Horus is the falcon. And so he's purely in his animal state in this part, right? He's not a composite hawk head human body, which we will see him like that in other places as well. And then how is he interacting with the human? Can you see that he's holding a tether? And the tether is basically connected to this strange thing here. We have a human head, and then it kind of looks like a rat. Not weird, right? So this is a ruler from another part of Egypt. And so Horus is assisting this guy, right? This is the ruler, right? This is the ruler. He's assisting him in combining or taking over this other section of Egypt, right? And so you can see how he's aiding the human. So this is the ruler. And I know that he's the ruler because what emblems of power does he have? Catherine? He has a headdress. This is called the white headdress or the white crown. And the reason I remember that it's the white crown is it looks like a bowling pin, and bowling pins typically are white. We'll have the red crown as well, which are early crowns of Egypt. And besides him wearing that lovely bowling pin headdress, what else is symbols of power here? What else do we have? Yeah, Angie. He's got a club in his hand, and this one he's pretty vicious. Like he looks like he's about ready to strike. This one, he's holding his head, and he kind of looks similar to this guy, doesn't he? Kind of looks similar. What else tells us he's the ruler? It might seem obvious. Yeah. Right, he's got like a little, like a skirt, I was gonna say a kilt and a skirt at the same time. So he's got like a little skirt on. Yeah. He's much bigger, right? We have a hierarchic scale, right? He's much bigger than all of the other characters on this panel. He's also, even though his arm is raised, he's still rather stiff, right? If you tried to stand like this, you'd be kind of uncomfortable. So his head is in profile, his shoulders are frontal, and his legs are in profile, right? Unless you do yoga, that's pretty hard to do, right? And so he's in a very stiff, sort of formal way of being presented. And these are conventions of power you will see for 3,000 years in ancient Egypt, right? Stiff, formal, profile, front, profile. And that's how we see rulers. Real people, or lesser people, are much more realistic. So this little thing that I said was a raft, this basically is symbolic of the Nile. So this is lotus plants that come from the region of Lower Egypt. And so this is this ruler taking over this section of Lower Egypt. So it's like a personification of a region of Egypt. And so that's that biggest part of this section. And then at the very bottom, what do we have? Yeah. They are basically the, the defeated, right? And so notice how realistic they are. Super, super realistic. And there, if you look at it, besides their naturalistic poses, there's this little, almost like postage stamp there. That once again is like a fortified city or a citadel, right? Some sort of structure there. So you can see how a lot of these images are very symbolic and not realistic in size, right? It's super, super tiny, obviously being much bigger than people. Okay, so at the very top, we have Hathor. This is on the flip side, next page in the study guide. On the very top is Hathor and the name of Narmer again. And then at the very top register, remember registers, right? Top register, what do we have? What do we have? What seems to be taking place? Talk to your neighbor. What seems to be taking place? Okay, what's taking place? What's taking place? What'd you come up with, Nicole? Exactly. It's a procession that is celebrating the unification of Lower and Upper Egypt, right? And so I know this because we have our king again, right? And he's Narmer. And how do I know he's Narmer? Look at his name. There's a catfish and a chisel right by him. So often they will put the names right by the person, right? And this time, instead of wearing the bowling pin Upper Egypt headdress, he's wearing the Lower Egypt red headdress or red crown. And it has this little spiral to it. Okay. One thing you'll notice is that behind him is a servant and he's carrying his sandals. Does anyone know what being barefoot symbolizes? Has anyone ever been in a temple before and had to remove their shoes? Yes. And why do we do that? To show respect to the gods and to know that we're walking on sacred ground, right? So we do it out of respect and for honoring this sacred ground that we're on. So he's barefoot, he's got his sandal bearer back there, and then we have our procession. And we have standards, we have emblems of power, and there's images of Horus and feathers on those standards as well. And then, what is Narmer being presented with? What's this? What is all that stuff on the right? And right? Exactly. This is the defeated. So this would be lower Egyptian warriors. And so they have their head between their legs. They've been decapitated. If you notice that there is a boat at the very top, boats were often symbolic of death, but it also could be transporting up and down the Nile and a symbol of that too. So once again, symbol of power, hierarchic scale, formal, profile, front, profile, right? Holding something, typical symbols of power. This once again is in a low relief, okay? Now, the middle part of this is kind of interesting. This is where this thing becomes a palette. And so these palettes are the makeup palettes that they would use to apply their eye makeup, okay? Now, normally these palettes are small and you can hold it in your hand. This palette, I've seen a recreation of it, is about 2 feet tall. Is that an effective palette for putting on your eye makeup? No, this was a palette probably for a god image. It was buried in a temple. So this was probably some sort of votive presented to the god in a temple. And so this little divot in here would be where the eye makeup would be kept for the eyeliner for the god. Okay. And so to make that divot, what do we have here? What is this thing? Some sort of creature, right? This is called a, let me see, make sure I say it right, a serapard. So S-E-R-P-O-P-A-R-D-S. So S-E-R-P-O-P-A-R-D-S. And this was a mythical animal. Kind of like a leopard in a way, with a long neck, like a serpent. And this is a symbol of the unification of Lower and Upper Egypt. What is the visual evidence that shows me this is about unification? Nicole? There, exactly. 2 have become 1. And we have red crown, white crown, defeating ruler, right? So this gives us why this is commemorative, like this is commemorate the unification of Lower and Upper Egypt. So here we have more realistic people kind of wrangling these mythical creatures. And then at the very bottom, what do we have? What do we have here? What's a bull often symbolize? What's bull symbolize? Catherine's that arm. Right, it's an image of power. And so this is symbolic of the king breaking through the citadel or the fortress of the lower king of Egypt and unifying the lands of Egypt. So he's knocking down the walls. So this, once again, is not made for a king. This is not something that was actually functional. This was a votive for a god image in a temple. Right? So these are, like I said, the conventions that we're going to see over and over and over again. Centralized ruler, bigger than everyone else, wearing a headdress, holding a staff. Sit, not realistic. Okay? This will pretty much be the formula for 3,000 years, with like one exception, and we'll see the exception in a few days. Okay, so a little bit of vocabulary, right? Egyptian style is often considered to be twisted perspective as well. And so twisted perspective is that profile head, frontal body, profile leg, right? Those are words that are interchangeable. And if you use Egyptian style or twisted perspective, I would know what you're talking about. My old textbook also called it the law of frontality. And basically what that means is that you give your viewer information to make them understand the content. Because notice that this is kind of like I'm standing on the side, but the dead bodies are like an aerial view. I would not understand the abundance of the dead bodies if it was just a profile of one or two people. But I take the point of view that makes me understand the content the best. Right? So it doesn't all have to be on the same point of view to be able to understand. Okay, so when it comes to Egyptian art, there's two important definitions that we will see, right? Now, these links don't work anymore. I really need to find some others. But naturalism, okay? If I said the word naturalism to you, what first comes to mind? If I say naturalism, any educated guesses what that means? When I think naturalism, I think more realistic, looking like a real thing, looking as it does in its natural state. And there are times where the Egyptians could be pretty realistic. Now, not as realistic as we'll see in later cultures like the Romans, but there's times when they're going to be very realistic. They also have this thing called idealization, right? If I were going to portray myself as my ideal self, what would that look like, right? And so idealization is kind of like better than it really was. And so that's kind of a key concept when we see a few of these different images, right? Do you think he's natural or idealized? Natural or idealized? Yeah. He's definitely, this is Khafre, one of the pharaohs of the old kingdom, right? And because he's a pharaoh, he's stiff and formal. He's in a 90-degree angle, right? Notice how his body is very erect. His legs go horizontal, then his legs go vertically down. He's seated on a throne, and he's got like defined muscles, right? Now, he could be 40 years old here, but he still has the youthful body of an 18-year-old or a 20-year-old, right? And this is something very common in the ancient world. The Greeks did this a lot as well, right? Showing someone in their natural, like in their best ideal form, because it shows them in their most powerful form, right? So this is the ruler of the Sphinx, by the way. This is the ruler of the Sphinx. This is the ruler who had that pyramid behind the Sphinx. So you can see how he has emblems of power. He has Horus protecting his head. He's wearing the cobra headdress. This is the one that you often see in turquoise and gold. And he's seated on a throne that has lion's claws on it and flowers and lotus plants from the Nile. So it has all these emblems of power. Right? Now this is in the 250. This is King Menkaura and the Queen. Do you think they are naturalistic or are they idealized? What do you think? They are also idealized. So we see the king image We've seen a king and his queen, right? So who is represented in the content of this one? Who is represented? We have our king, and how do I know he's a king? What are his emblems of power? He has his headdress. We call that the Nemes headdress, N-E-M-E-S. So he's got the cobra headdress on. And so we know he is the king. He's got his little kilt on. He's bare chested. Now, this person to his right, we don't actually know exactly who she is. There are some people who say wife, and there's some people who say mother. Most people think mother, right? But if you were going to say it's mother, what would be the symbol or the visual evidence that would say this is his mother? Anything about this that say it's his mother? Look at their faces. Is there anything about their faces that make us think that they could be related? Don't they look similar? Right? They kind of look similar. So some people think this is mother and son, and she's basically like proud of him. Look at her arms. She's got her arm wrapped around his waist. She's got her arm on his other arm, and it's like presenting her son, right? And then others think it's wife. Is there anything about this visually that would go, oh, this is wife? What do you think? Wife. Yeah. Right? It could be a more loving embrace, a more relationship one rather than just proud, right? And she's also very youthful. Notice how you see her body pressing through the thin fabric, right? And so you can see the indication of her breast, her belly, right? Her legs pressing through. And so we're not quite sure. And she's younger here, right? But, right? Do Egyptians portray people in their realistic age? No, they show people in their idealistic state. So this was found in a funerary tomb. We think it's Menkaura. He's one of the kings, one of the pharaohs of the Great Pyramids. And we think that this is his mother, but we're not quite sure. You don't need to memorize her name. It's not in the title, so don't worry about it. Okay, but I have it for you if you care. This was found in the funerary temple, or the valley temple, I should say, of Menkaura. And so this is a part of the pyramid complex. So when I say valley temple, the Nile is right here. So it's in the Nile Valley, right? And then there is a funerary temple and a walkway. And then you get to the valley temple. There's a walkway, and then there's a funerary temple closer to the tomb, right? And so this was a part of the structures that were used for the funeral of him. A lot of the body preparation was done along the Nile, because the bodies were transported along the Nile as well. Okay, so this is in Giza, right? This is not a large sculpture. This is actually found at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And so I was really surprised when I went there. I assumed it was at least life size, if not bigger, but it's actually quite small because it was just meant to decorate a tomb. Right? So we'll look again at this a little bit more when we look at the pyramids, right? And so why was it made? It was made to decorate this valley temple and to pay homage to Menkaura and his mother, or Menkaura and his wife. We'll stop there and we will look at a few more funerary images, and then we'll see some other images too. This is more typical mother and son imagery. By the way, notice how son, you guys at Central can start getting your, notice how son here is just a miniature version of a pharaoh. He's shown as an adult, but just in miniature size, because we wouldn't want to show a pharaoh as a weak child, right? That's not his most ideal. He could be vulnerable then. We want to show him always powerful.